Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where forgotten civilizations, unexplained wonders, and ancient secrets come back to life. Ready to unravel the mystery? Let's begin the journey. Beneath the magnificent dome of St. Peter's Basilica lies another world, a silent city of the dead known as the Vatican Necropolis. This ancient Roman cemetery, buried for centuries, is said to hold the answer to one of Christianity's greatest mysteries. To understand the profound mystery that lies beneath St. Peter's Basilica, we must first peel back the layers of time. We must strip away the magnificent Renaissance dome of Michelangelo, remove the opulent marble and gold of the Grand Basilica, and even look past the first great church that stood here for over 1,000 years. We must go back to a time before this place was the sacred center of the Christian world, to a time when it was something else entirely. We must travel back to the 1st century AD, to the age of the Roman Caesars, and see this land not through the eyes of a pilgrim, but through the eyes of an ordinary Roman citizen. When we do, we find that the story of what lies beneath St. Peter's begins not with a church, not with a saint, but with a simple, inescapable fact of life in the ancient world: death. In the 1st century AD, the area we now call Vatican City was not part of the city of Rome. It lay outside the city's formal boundaries, across the Tiber River, on the gentle slope of a hill known as the Ager Vaticanus, or Vatican Fields. This area was a mixture of things. There were luxurious villas and gardens owned by the wealthy, including the gardens of Agrippina the Elder, the mother of the infamous Emperor Caligula. But for the most part, it was considered an unhealthy and undesirable place. The Roman historian Tacitus described it as an unwholesome region, and it was known for its snake infestations and cheap wine. Because of its location outside the sacred precinct of the city proper, and because Roman law strictly forbade burials within the city walls, the Vatican Hill, like many areas along the major roads leading out of Rome, became a popular burial ground. It became a necropolis, literally, a city of the dead. This was not a potter's field for the poor and destitute. It was a bustling, active cemetery used by middle-class Romans and even some wealthy families. It was a place where people would come to honor their ancestors and ensure their memory was preserved. The necropolis was organized along a small, east-west road that ran up the side of the hill. On either side of this road, families would purchase plots of land and construct their own private mausoleums. These were not simple graves in the ground. They were small house-like structures, built of brick and concrete, often with beautifully decorated interiors. A family would save for years to build a tomb that would stand as a testament to their status and their devotion to their departed loved ones. Walking along this road in the 2nd century AD would have felt like walking down a residential street, but a street where all the houses were silent, their inhabitants sleeping in eternal sleep. The exteriors of these tombs were often quite plain, but inside, they were a vibrant explosion of art and memory. The walls were covered in colorful frescoes and intricate mosaics. There were niches called columbaria for holding the cremation urns of family members, as cremation was a common practice. There were also larger stone coffins or sarcophagi for those who preferred inhumation or full-body burial. The decorations often depicted scenes from mythology, images of the 4 seasons to represent the cycle of life, or portraits of the deceased themselves, ensuring they would never be forgotten. These were intensely personal spaces, designed to be visited by the living. Families would hold memorial banquets inside the tombs on the anniversary of a loved one's death, sharing a meal in the presence of their ancestors. This was a Roman necropolis in its prime, a place that was simultaneously a graveyard, an art gallery, and a center of family ritual. And for a time it was an exclusively pagan place, dedicated to the Roman gods and the spirits of the ancestors. But as the 1st century wore on, a new and secretive faith began to take root in the city of Rome, and its followers too would seek a final resting place for their dead on the Vatican Hill. This brings us to the second and most pivotal part of our story, the moment when this ordinary Roman cemetery, becomes the focus of an extraordinary Christian tradition. This part of the story centers on one of the most important figures in all of Christianity, Simon the fisherman from Galilee, the man whom Jesus Christ called Peter, the rock upon which he would build his church. According to centuries of tradition, after the death of Christ, Peter traveled to Rome, the capital of the empire, to preach the new faith. He became the leader of the small, burgeoning Christian community in the city, its first bishop. For a time the Christians in Rome were a minor, often ignored Jewish sect. But in the year 64 AD that all changed. A great fire swept through the city of Rome, destroying vast sections of it. The deeply unpopular Emperor Nero, facing rumors that he had started the fire himself to clear land for a new palace, needed a scapegoat. He chose the Christians. Nero launched the first major state-sponsored persecution of the Christian faith. The Roman historian Tacitus, who was not a Christian and had little sympathy for them, gives a chilling account of what happened next. He describes how Christians were rounded up, falsely accused of hatred of the human race, and subjected to the most horrific forms of execution for the entertainment of the Roman public. Some were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were crucified. And some, Tacitus writes, were coated in pitch, tied to posts, and set on fire to serve as human torches to illuminate Nero's garden parties. The primary location for these gruesome spectacles was a large open-air arena that Nero had built on the Vatican Hill, in the gardens he had inherited from his mother. This arena was known as the Circus of Nero. According to a tradition that is one of the oldest and most consistent in the Christian faith, it was here in this very circus that the Apostle Peter was executed. The tradition holds that Peter, as the leader of the community, was arrested and sentenced to death by crucifixion. Believing himself unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord, he is said to have requested to be crucified upside down. This event, which would have taken place sometime between 64 and 67 AD, transformed the Vatican Hill from just another piece of Roman territory into a site of profound significance for the small Christian community. It was now a place of martyrdom. After his execution, Peter's followers would have faced a critical task: to recover his body and give it a proper burial. This would have been a dangerous act, but one that was deeply important to them. They would have taken his body from the cross and, looking for a nearby place to bury him, they would have naturally turned to the public necropolis that lay on the slope of the hill, just a stone's throw away from the Circus of Nero where he had died. They would not have been able to afford one of the grand brick mausoleums. Peter was a poor, foreign fisherman, not a Roman aristocrat. So, according to the tradition, they buried him in a simple, humble grave dug directly into the earth, on a sloping, less desirable part of the cemetery. It was an anonymous burial, marked perhaps by a simple stone or a few tiles, known only to the small community of believers who had laid him to rest. But for them, this simple patch of ground was now the most sacred place on earth. It was the final resting place of their leader, the apostle to whom Christ had given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And so from this point on, other Christians in Rome began to seek burial in the Vatican Necropolis, wanting to be laid to rest as close as possible to the grave of the first apostle. The pagan cemetery slowly began to welcome Christian dead. As the years went on, and the Christian community grew in size and confidence, they sought to honor the site of Peter's grave more formally. A simple earth grave was vulnerable and could be lost to time. So, sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, around the year 160 AD, the Roman Christians built a small monument or shrine, directly over the spot they believed to be Peter's tomb. This was not a grand church. It was a simple 3-niche structure, open to the air, known as a trophy or edicula. It was a memorial, a marker that said to the world, something important is here. A Roman Christian priest named Gaius, writing around the year 200 AD, mentions this very monument. He boasts to a rival Christian leader, "I can show you the trophies of the apostles." For if you will go to the Vatican or to the Austrian Way, you will find the trophies of those who laid the foundations of this church. He was referring to the tomb of Peter on the Vatican Hill, and the tomb of Paul on the Austrian Way. For centuries, this small, open-air shrine became the focal point of Christian devotion at the site. It was the physical anchor for a tradition that was being passed down from one generation to the next. The pagan necropolis continued to operate around it, but at its heart now lay a tiny, but powerful Christian secret. This brings us to the third and final act in the story of how this ancient city of the dead was preserved. For nearly 2 centuries, the necropolis continued to exist in this hybrid state, a place where pagan and Christian dead lay side by side. But in the early 4th century, the entire Roman world was turned upside down. A new emperor, Constantine the Great, came to power. And in a move that would change the course of Western history, Constantine converted to Christianity. With the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, he ended the persecution of the Christians and made Christianity a favored religion of the empire. Constantine was an ambitious builder, and he wanted to honor the new faith with a series of grand churches, or basilicas, built over the most sacred sites of the religion. He built great basilicas in Jerusalem over the site of Christ's tomb, and in Bethlehem over the site of his birth. And in Rome, he decided to build a magnificent basilica to honor the Prince of the Apostles, St. Peter. There was only one place he could build it, on the Vatican Hill, directly over the small shrine that marked the location of Peter's tomb. But this presented his engineers with a massive architectural challenge. The necropolis was built on a steep sloping hillside. It was not a suitable foundation for a massive flat-floored basilica. To build his church, Constantine had to create a huge level platform. Any modern engineer would have solved this problem by simply leveling the hill, demolishing the tombs, and clearing the site. But Constantine did something remarkable. He had a deep and perhaps superstitious respect for the dead. The necropolis was a sacred space, filled with the tombs of both pagans and Christians, and Roman law held that burial grounds were inviolable. To destroy them would have been an act of profound sacrilege. So, Constantine and his engineers came up with an ingenious and incredibly laborious solution. Instead of demolishing the necropolis, they decided to bury it. They embarked on a massive landfill project. They began at the lower end of the cemetery and constructed a massive retaining wall. Then they brought in thousands upon thousands of tons of earth and rubble, which they used to fill in the entire necropolis. They carefully filled the alleyways and the spaces between the tombs. They knocked off the roofs of the taller mausoleums so that they would not be higher than the desired floor level, and then they filled the interiors of the tombs themselves with earth, right up to their ceilings. Slowly and deliberately, the entire city of the dead was entombed. The colorful frescoes, the intricate mosaics, the marble sarcophagi, and the humble grave of a fisherman were all buried under a mountain of dirt. Once they had created a massive, flat, stable platform, they began construction of the first St. Peter's Basilica directly on top of it. The high altar of Constantine's new church was positioned with pinpoint accuracy, directly over the small, now-buried shrine that marked the tomb of Peter. This single incredible act of engineering had an unintended and miraculous consequence. By burying the necropolis, Constantine had inadvertently created a perfect time capsule. He had sealed an entire section of a 1st and 2nd century Roman cemetery away from the ravages of time, from the destructive forces of weather, war, and subsequent builders. The tombs were not destroyed. They were preserved, frozen in time, waiting in the silent darkness beneath the floor of the great basilica. For the next 1,200 years, Old St. Peter's Basilica stood as one of the most important churches in Christendom. And then in the 16th century, it was torn down to make way for the even grander basilica that we see today. But even as the new church was built, the secret of the necropolis remained, its existence almost entirely forgotten. A few vague traditions and old documents hinted at a cemetery beneath the church, but no one knew for sure what was there. The city of the dead slept on, its streets and houses filled with earth, its existence a secret kept for over 1,600 years, waiting for a moment centuries in the future, when a modern pope's decision would accidentally bring its long-lost world back into the light. For more than 16 centuries, the ancient city of the dead slept in undisturbed darkness. Buried deep beneath the floor of first one great basilica and then another, the Roman necropolis on Vatican Hill had become little more than a whisper, a footnote in dusty church archives. The world above had changed beyond recognition. The Roman Empire had fallen, the Middle Ages had come and gone, the Renaissance had bloomed, and the modern world was taking shape. Through it all, the silent street of tombs remained a perfect, sealed time capsule, its existence almost entirely forgotten. But in the midst of the 20th century, during one of the darkest periods in modern history, a decision made by a reigning pope would accidentally set in motion a chain of events that would pierce that darkness and bring the long-lost necropolis back into the light. This is the story of the Scavi, the secret excavations that would become one of the most remarkable and sensitive archaeological projects ever undertaken. Our story resumes in the year 1939. The world was on the brink of the Second World War. In the Vatican, a new pope, Pius XII, had just been elected. One of his early wishes was to prepare a suitable resting place for himself when his time came. He wanted his tomb to be located in the Vatican grottos, the subterranean level directly beneath the main floor of St. Peter's Basilica, where many previous popes were buried. He chose a spot near the tomb of Pope Pius XI and instructed his officials to begin the work of lowering a section of the floor to create more space. It was seen as a routine construction project, a minor modification to the ancient crypts. No one had any idea what they were about to uncover. As the workmen began to dig, carefully removing the floor of the grotto, they made a startling discovery. They broke through a layer of flooring and found that there was a void beneath it. Peering into the darkness with their lamps, they saw not solid ground or ancient foundations, but the top of another much older structure. The Vatican officials were immediately alerted. The foreman of the project, Monsignor Ludwig Koss, an exacting and secretive German prelate who was the administrator of St. Peter's Basilica, ordered the work to halt. He knew that they had stumbled upon something of immense historical importance. This was not just an old crypt. This was something from a much earlier time, something that predated the current basilica. Pope Pius XII was informed, and he was faced with a momentous decision. The discovery came at a terrible time. The war was escalating, and Italy was a dangerous and unstable place. Embarking on a major archaeological dig, under the very foundations of the most important church in Christendom, was a risky and expensive proposition. But the Pope was also a man of deep faith and historical curiosity. The possibility that they had found something connected to the earliest days of the church, perhaps even something related to the tomb of St. Peter himself, was too tantalizing to ignore. Against the backdrop of a world tearing itself apart, Pius XII made a secret historic decision. He authorized a full-scale archaeological excavation to be conducted in the utmost secrecy to explore what lay hidden in the depths beneath St. Peter's. This was the beginning of the Scavi, the Italian word for excavations. A small hand-picked team of Italy's top archaeologists, architects, and scholars was assembled. They were led by Monsignor Koss and worked under a strict vow of secrecy. The world could not know what they were doing. The political climate was too volatile, and the potential religious significance of any discovery was too immense to be handled in the glare of public opinion. For the next 10 years, as the war raged and then subsided, this small team worked in difficult and often dangerous conditions deep underground. They burrowed through the earth and rubble that Constantine's engineers had used to fill the cemetery, slowly and painstakingly revealing the secrets that had been buried for 16 centuries. What they found was breathtaking. As they cleared away the ancient landfill, they realized they had not just found a few isolated tombs. They had found an entire perfectly preserved Roman street. It was as if they had stepped through a doorway in time, back to the 2nd century AD. Before their eyes, an entire section of the Vatican Necropolis emerged from the earth, almost exactly as it had been on the day Constantine's workers sealed it up. They had uncovered a narrow, sloping road, and lining both sides of it were the magnificent house-like mausoleums of the Roman middle class. The preservation was stunning, because the tombs had been filled with dry earth and sealed away from the elements. The delicate decorations inside were in remarkable condition. The team found themselves walking through a gallery of ancient Roman art that no one had seen since the fall of the empire. The interiors of the tombs were a riot of color and imagery. There were vibrant frescoes depicting birds, flowers, and scenes from mythology. The tomb of the Fanii family featured a beautiful painting of a peacock, an early pagan symbol of eternity and immortality that was later adopted by Christians. The tomb of the Julie family contained one of the most astonishing discoveries of all, a ceiling mosaic dating from the late 3rd century that depicted a figure who looked exactly like Jesus Christ, but portrayed as the Roman sun god, Sol Invictus, riding a golden chariot and surrounded by a radiant halo. It was a stunning example of religious syncretism, a piece of art that existed on the very cusp between the old pagan world and the new Christian one. They found marble sarcophagi carved with intricate reliefs of Dionysian revels. They found funerary altars, inscriptions bearing the names of the deceased, and even small clay pipes that the Romans had installed so they could pour liquid offerings like wine down into the graves of their loved ones during memorial feasts. The excavations provided an unprecedented, intimate glimpse into the lives, beliefs, and funerary customs of ordinary Romans. But the team knew that this was not their primary mission. These beautiful pagan tombs were fascinating, but they were not the ultimate prize. Their true goal, the secret hope that drove the entire project, was to follow the trail of clues that might lead them to the one specific grave that had caused Constantine to bury this entire cemetery in the first place, the long-lost tomb of the Apostle Peter. And as they carefully mapped the layout of the necropolis, they began to notice a curious pattern. The archaeologists realized that the necropolis was not uniform. The grandest, most expensive mausoleums were located at the eastern and western ends of the excavated street. But in the center of the necropolis, the terrain became steeper and less suitable for building. In this central area, the grand mausoleums gave way to a more humble and crowded collection of simpler graves. It was clear that all the elaborate family tombs were deliberately clustered around this one, less desirable section of the cemetery. It was as if they were all trying to get as close as possible to something in that central area. This was a powerful clue. The layout of the necropolis itself seemed to be pointing them towards a specific focal point. They were getting warmer. Following this invisible line of devotion, the team focused their efforts on this central open-air section of the cemetery, a plot of land they designated Field P. And it was here, in this humble field, that they found what they had been searching for. Rising from the ancient ground level was a wall, and built against that wall were the unmistakable remains of a small three-niched monument. It was the Aedicula, the 2nd century shrine, the trophy of Gaius, exactly where centuries of tradition and old documents had said it should be. The discovery was a moment of profound vindication. It was the first time in history that archaeology had provided solid, physical proof to corroborate the ancient tradition of Peter's burial on Vatican Hill. The shrine was real. It had been built in the middle of a pagan cemetery, and it was clearly the reason why both later Christians and even some pagan families had chosen to be buried nearby. The excitement among the excavation team was electric. They had found the 2nd century marker. Now they had to find what it was marking. With extreme care, they began to excavate the ground directly beneath the shrine. The area was a complex jumble of later burials, all crowded around the Aedicula, a testament to the desire of early Christians to be buried ad Sanctum Petrum, near St. Peter. They carefully removed these later graves, digging deeper and deeper into the earth, back towards the original first-century ground level. As they cleared the final layers of soil from directly beneath the central niche of the shrine, they found it. But it was not what they might have expected. There was no marble sarcophagus, no grand tombstone, no treasure. Instead, there was only a simple, humble grave, dug directly into the earth. It was empty. The discovery of an empty grave might seem like a disappointment, an anticlimax to a decade of secret, painstaking work. But for the archaeologists, it was anything but. It was another stunning confirmation of the tradition. The grave was empty because, according to the theory, the bones of the saint had been moved at some point in history to protect them from desecration. But the presence of the grave itself in that exact spot, directly beneath the second-century shrine, was proof that the earliest Roman Christians believed, with absolute certainty, that this was the original burial place of the apostle. They had built their most important memorial on this spot for a reason. The empty grave was the focal point around which the entire history of the site and indeed, the entire history of St. Peter's Basilica revolved. The secret excavations had succeeded in their primary goal. They had followed the clues from the grand mausoleums to the humble open field, and they had zeroed in on the exact location that the earliest Christians had revered as the tomb of St. Peter. The scavi had uncovered the physical heart of the tradition. But one great mystery remained. The grave was empty. Where were the bones? The search for the sacred relics, the final and most controversial chapter of the excavation, was about to begin. The discovery of the empty grave beneath the ancient shrine was a moment of incredible triumph and profound mystery. The secret excavations, the scavi, had achieved what many thought was impossible. After a decade of tireless work in the dark, cramped spaces beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the team of archaeologists had proven that the centuries-old tradition was not just a pious legend. It was rooted in a real physical place. They had found the second-century memorial, the Trophy of Gaius, and they had found the humble, first-century burial that it was built to honor. The geography of the faith was confirmed, but this triumph only led to a deeper, more tantalizing question. The grave was empty. If this was truly the tomb of the Apostle Peter, where were his bones? This question would launch the final and most controversial phase of the investigation, a scientific and archaeological detective story that would hinge on a forgotten box of bones, cryptic ancient graffiti, and a debate that continues to this day. This is the story of the search for the physical remains of the Prince of the Apostles. The first question the team had to address was a simple one. Did they actually find a tomb? The answer was a definitive yes. The excavation had revealed, with archaeological certainty, that the central point of the entire necropolis was a humble grave, dug directly into the clay of Vatican Hill. The fact that this simple grave was later honored with the construction of the Edicula, a formal memorial, and that subsequent generations of Christians went to great lengths and expense to be buried as close as possible to it, was overwhelming evidence that this specific spot was considered to be of supreme importance. This was not just any grave. It was treated as the grave. The archaeological context was undeniable. The team had located the site that the earliest Roman Christians revered as the tomb of Peter. But the emptiness of the grave was a puzzle. There were several possible explanations. One was that the bones had been stolen or destroyed at some point during the periodic persecutions that Christians faced in the Roman Empire. Another was that the tradition was mistaken, and that Peter was never buried there at all. But a third possibility, and the one that the Vatican team held onto, was that the bones had been deliberately moved by the early Christians themselves. An earth-dug grave was vulnerable. It offered little protection from the elements, from grave robbers, or from hostile authorities. It is entirely plausible that at some point, perhaps during a time of intense persecution like that under the Emperor Valerian in the mid-3rd century, the Christian community decided to move the sacred relics of their founder to a safer, more secure location. This would have been an act of immense reverence, an attempt to protect the physical remains of the apostle from desecration. If this were true, it meant the bones might still be somewhere nearby, hidden in a secret location close to the original tomb. As the archaeologists meticulously examined every inch of the area around the empty grave and the shrine, their attention was drawn to the wall against which the shrine was built. This wall, known as the Red Wall, because of its reddish plaster, was covered in a complex network of ancient graffiti. Most of it was simply the names of pilgrims who had visited the shrine over the centuries, scratching their names into the plaster to mark their visit. But one inscription, very close to the central niche of the shrine, seemed to be more significant. It was a Greek inscription, and though it was difficult to decipher, it appeared to read Petros Eni, which translates to Peter is within, or Peter is here. This was a tantalizing clue. It suggested that someone at some point was trying to say that the body of Peter was located not just at the shrine in general, but specifically within or inside this very wall. This is where the story takes a dramatic turn, and where it becomes a tale of academic rivalry, and a near miss that almost cost history one of its greatest discoveries. The official archaeological team, led by Monsignor Koss, had completed their primary work by 1949. They had found the tomb and the shrine and had published their initial findings. But one of the key members of the team, a brilliant epigrapher and archaeologist named Margherita Garducci, was not satisfied. She felt that Monsignor Koss, who was more of an administrator than a hands-on archaeologist, had been overly controlling and had overlooked crucial details, particularly the graffiti. After the official excavation was over, Professor Garducci continued her own private investigation for years, painstakingly deciphering the hundreds of ancient scribbles on the Red Wall. It was she who definitively translated the Petros Eni inscription, and it was she who made the connection that would change everything. During the initial excavations in the early 1940s, the workmen had discovered a small secondary niche, a loculus carved into the Red Wall, very close to the main shrine and the empty grave. This niche was not part of the original wall. It had been crudely carved out later, and it was lined with marble, a sign that it was intended to hold something of great importance. When the workmen first found this niche, it was filled with rubble and some old human bones. Monsignor Koss, in what would later be seen as a moment of almost catastrophic oversight, had examined the bones, dismissed them as being from a later, unimportant burial, and had them placed in a simple wooden box and stored away in a Vatican storeroom, where they were promptly forgotten. For over a decade, the most important potential discovery of the entire excavation sat in a dusty box, its significance completely unrecognized. Professor Garducci, through her study of the graffiti and her reconstruction of the history of the site, became convinced that this forgotten niche was the key. The Petros Eni inscription was located right next to it. She believed that this was the safer place where the early Christians had moved the bones of St. Peter from the vulnerable earth grave. They had carved this niche into the wall, lined it with precious marble, placed the bones inside, and then sealed it up, with the graffiti acting as a secret marker for those who knew where to look. She embarked on a determined quest to find the forgotten box of bones. After a long search through the vast storerooms of the Vatican, she finally found it, labeled simply with the contents of the niche from which it had been taken. She had found the bones that Monsignor Koss had dismissed years earlier. Now she had to find out what they were. This brings us to the second crucial question in our mystery. Did they find the bones? The discovery of the box was just the beginning. The bones inside had to be analyzed. Professor Garducci enlisted the help of a team of forensic anthropologists to study the remains. The results of their analysis were electrifying. The box contained the bones of a single individual, not a jumble of different burials. The bones were those of a male, and based on their size and structure, he was a robust or powerfully built individual. Most importantly, scientific analysis determined that the man had died at an advanced age, likely between 60 and 70 years old. All of these details a single, elderly, robust male were perfectly consistent with the traditional account of the Apostle Peter, a fisherman who would have been powerfully built and who was believed to have been crucified in his old age. But there was more. The bones were encrusted with earth. When this earth was analyzed, it was found to be of a type consistent with the soil from the original first-century grave that had been found directly beneath the shrine. This suggested that the bones had originally been buried in that very spot. Furthermore, mixed in with the bones were fragments of a precious, purple-colored cloth that had been woven with threads of pure gold. This was an incredibly significant find. In the Roman Empire, purple dye was astronomically expensive and its use was reserved for the emperor and for the highest religious ceremonies. The fact that these bones had been wrapped in such a rare and valuable cloth was a sign of extreme reverence. It was the kind of honor that would have been bestowed upon the most sacred of relics. The scientific evidence was mounting. The age, sex, and physical type of the individual were correct. The soil on the bones linked them to the original grave. And the precious cloth in which they were wrapped indicated that they were considered to be relics of the highest importance. Professor Garducci was convinced. She believed she had found the physical remains of St. Peter. In 1968, after years of painstaking research, the final and most dramatic question was ready to be answered, at least from the Vatican's perspective. Are these bones really St. Peter's? Based on the overwhelming body of evidence compiled by Professor Garducci and her team, Pope Paul VI made a historic announcement. He declared to the world that the relics of St. Peter had been identified, in a manner which we believe convincing. For the Catholic Church, the case was closed. The journey that had begun with a simple construction project had ended with the rediscovery of the physical remains of its founder. The bones were placed in a series of sealed plexiglass containers and returned to their ancient resting place, the marble-lined niche in the red wall, where they remain to this day, visible to the small groups of pilgrims who are granted permission to tour the necropolis. But is the case really closed? While the Vatican and many of the faithful accept the findings as conclusive, the verdict in the wider academic and scientific community is more nuanced. The evidence is undeniably compelling, but it is also circumstantial. There is no smoking gun. No piece of evidence that provides absolute, irrefutable proof. For example, there is no name inscribed on the bones or on the box. There is no DNA evidence that can definitively link the remains to a first-century Galilean fisherman. We have no known DNA from Peter or any of his relatives to compare it to. The identification rests on a chain of inferences, a preponderance of the evidence argument. Skeptics and many outside scholars, while acknowledging the importance of the discoveries, raise several valid points. They argue that while the bones are of a man from the correct period, there is no way to be 100% certain that they belong to Peter. The necropolis was a crowded place, and other elderly Christian men would have been buried there. The graffiti Petros Iani is compelling, but it is also open to interpretation. Could it have been added later by a pilgrim? Could it refer to the grave itself, rather than the niche in the wall? They also point to the fact that the skull was missing from the collection of bones found in the niche. This is a significant problem, as the preservation of the head of a saint, the caput, was of paramount importance in the cult of relics. The Vatican claims that the skull of St. Peter has been preserved separately since the early Middle Ages in the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome. But there is no way to scientifically prove that the skull in that reliquary and the bones from the necropolis belong to the same person. The debate, therefore, comes down to a fundamental difference in how one weighs the evidence. For the Vatican, the convergence of so many different lines of evidence, the location of the grave, the shrine built over it, the clustering of other tombs, the graffiti on the wall, the age and type of the bones, the soil, and the precious cloth creates a case that is beyond any reasonable doubt. For a devout believer, this body of evidence is more than enough to confirm their faith. For a more skeptical outside observer, however, each link in that chain contains a small element of uncertainty. The evidence is strong, but it is not absolute. They would argue that while it is highly probable that these are the bones that 2nd and 3rd century Christians believed to be St. Peter's, we can never be scientifically certain that their belief was correct. And so the mystery of the bones remains. It is a mystery that exists in the fascinating gray area between historical proof and religious faith. The journey into the Vatican Necropolis leads us down through the layers of history, to a silent street of Roman tombs, to the foot of a simple shrine, and to a humble empty grave. It leads us to a forgotten box of bones, and a puzzle of forensic and archaeological clues. The Vatican has presented its solution to that puzzle, a solution that it believes closes one of the oldest cold cases in history. But like all great mysteries that touch upon the deepest foundations of faith and identity, the final verdict may ultimately lie not in the evidence itself, but in the eyes of the beholder. The bones in the niche remain a powerful symbol, a physical link to the very dawn of Christianity, but they also remain an object of debate, a silent testament to the enduring challenge of proving a 2,000-year-old truth. The Vatican Necropolis offers a rare journey into the very foundations of the Christian faith. It reveals a place where history and faith converge. Whether the bones in the box truly belong to the Apostle Peter is a question that may never be answered with certainty. If the past still whispers to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Ancient Relics Keeper, because some mysteries were never meant to be buried.